Hello and welcome to this special report which comes to you from the Radicalization Awareness Network RAN Practitioners. I'm Hajer Koubi. This program is the fourth in a series which explores topical issues of relevance to practitioners across the European Union. And today's program comes to you from Brussels, where we're going to take an in-depth look at the current working environment for practitioners. We'll be looking at how the violent extremist threats have evolved over the past few years and what impact this has had for practitioners and their work. We'll also be asking if practitioners are sufficiently equipped with the knowledge, skills, tools and resources to properly tackle these threats. And we'll be discussing whether there are simply enough practitioners doing this work and whether we should engage more young people in PCVE. Now, joining me to discuss this is Annelies Pauwels, a research fellow at the Flemish Peace Institute and an active member of the RAN Practitioners Network. Annelies, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Annelies, if I can start, over the past few years, we have focused on a number of emerging threats you see in the landscape of PCVE. What role do you think that technology has, had on the PCVE landscape?
Technology definitely has played a much bigger role in the radicalization process, because it really is something that facilitates radicalization. And I think a lot is being done at the moment in the field of online prevention, but it's still something that is at an experimental phase, I would say.
Right, so you wouldn't say that it is sufficient as of right now?
Well, I think many organizations are trying, and they're really trying to find means to address young people or vulnerable people to radicalization online. For practitioners, it requires a lot of training, being aware to adequately work with these tools as well in order to make the shift also towards the digital world.
So, if the threats are multiplying, becoming more complex and interdependent, is there sufficient capacity and capability to deal with it? We asked Ariane Wolf from the Violence Prevention Network, dealing with radicalization across Germany, to share her thoughts on this. So, let me start by asking Ariane, what are some of the new and emerging challenges that practitioners face?
It's becoming more and more challenging for local practitioners to fully understand how these transnational networks and transnational trends specifically impact their local context. So what does it really mean for their local scene, for their city, for their prison, for their school? What do they need to know about this in order to really tackle this issue?
And now how can we respond to such a complex and layered landscape?
We have to realize that we will have to create adaptable structures around this topic that can react to that. Otherwise, of course, the risk is that every time a policy shift happens and every time we are seeing a new threat emerge, we invest in something new, and that also means that we may lose the relationships and specialized expertise that we've been building over the past years that actually would be well able to contribute to the new challenge that we're seeing. Using local structures to respond to different types of extremism is a promising pathway forward, because we know that useful interventions are not just about ideology, but also include, for instance, social work components, maybe anti-violence work, mental health services, all of these different services that need to be included in the network. And the ideological work is one component, but the whole network can still stay intact, so to say, and still adapt to new challenges. And this is the way that I think structures will need to also work and will need to adapt to really tackle these new challenges.
But to what extent do the practitioners have, the skills, the tools and resources that they need to do their work?
Practitioners are really well versed in what they do in their day-to-day, in their practical work. Most of them know very well who they need to refer to work on a case. One of the things that is really useful and that still isn't really implemented across the board is the need for having one contact point for a case to work with them on the long term. Because we know that useful interventions, especially tertiary prevention interventions, but also secondary prevention, are really, they really hinge on trust, and they really hinge on the trust between the client or the case, the person we want to work with, and the practitioners. So if these contact points frequently change, and at every shift and at every time that we make handover, we jeopardize that really important relationship that we need for our work. So one of the things that can be really useful is to have one contact point, one trusted person that mentors. A lot of practitioners find that they need current knowledge to sustain their work, but they don't have the time and resources to really do the research themselves. So it's really helpful if research can answer or provide some of the answers to the specific questions that practitioners are facing. It's really helpful if, let's say, practice and research aren't removed from one another, but actually are linked into each other.
And what about on a more international network level? I mean, given that many of the issues that we are facing are transnational.
Peer-to-peer support across for practitioners across different countries takes a long time to really get going, to become more concrete. Building these professional networks really takes a certain degree of intimacy and getting to know each other. What is needed are more small-scale and long-term formats.
And finally, in what ways do we need to hone our approach as a network to the environment that we face?
One of the things that would be really helpful to see is to have training that is done repeatedly. To have more investment in sort of long-term training programs versus one-offs. And have maybe similar groups of people working with each other to provide an atmosphere and a context where people can learn together and build a professional network that they can refer to if they have any problems, if they want advice, and so on.
Ariane Wolf, thank you so much for talking to me. It was illuminating to hear from your insights. Now, Annelies, we've just heard Ariane speak about the changing environment for PCVE practitioners and some possible responses to this. We also touched into the digital and technological element of it, right? I wanted to ask you, how important would you say it is to understand the online ecosystem for practitioners today?
It's definitely crucial for them to understand it, and I would say it's not that easy also, because if you think about, for instance, violent right-wing extremism, they're very good digitally, so they really know how to use the digital environment. They've created their own online subculture as well, a youth culture, and that's not always easy for practitioners to really understand that. And also to understand what are the differences between when is it still okay and when is it actually becoming worrying.
Right.
For instance, they make actively use of an element of youth culture. It's just dark humor, sarcasm, memes. So these are really elements that they use quite actively. And for young people, it might be appealing because this is something that they use in their daily life as well. Right. A meme that's maybe a bit over the top, but still okay. But they draw it in such a way that they tie the line to very extremist content, consistently attacking other population groups. So then for young people, it becomes quite complicated to understand where's the line. And that might be the case as well for practitioners. To understand really all these elements of this youth culture, I think.
And assess where the line is being crossed, right?
When is the line being crossed? When is it problematic? Right. Should I intervene? If I intervene, how should I intervene? Because how will I do it on the internet? Should I engage with the parents as well? Yeah. So there's a lot of questions that I think pop up in the online world, and it's really crucial to support practitioners to get to the right knowledge, to get training, to get the right tools, to get the right means, right. To know privacy-related issues, all these challenges that might right. pop up.
Ariane actually also touched upon this, right? The importance of professional networks like RAN, and especially the way in which we educate and support the practitioners. So how would you say, Annelies, that we can go best about educating and providing support to the professional development of practitioners?
I think there's a lot of ways, there's a lot that we ask from practitioners, and there's not always sufficient support that we give to them. For instance, when they work on online prevention, there's a lot of experimental work that is being done by a lot of practitioners in the EU. But there is not enough support, in my view, to evaluate this working. But often these are grassroots organizations, local organizations, and they don't always have the tools or the knowledge or the know-how to how to evaluate in a more scientifically way. Right. So that's something that you need to give them the support or the networking in order to do that.
We turn to Kelsey Bjornskaart from the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, ISD. Kelsey plays a prominent role in supporting the RAN Young platform, a network of young people from across the European Union engaged in PCVE. I asked her earlier, what role can young people play in the face of ever-multiplying and increasingly complex threats? Let's take a look. I want to start by a rather simple question, but I think a very crucial one, just to set the scene. But I was curious to hear from you, why would you say that it's so important to get youth voices included?
At the core of it, extremism has a substantial impact on young people. So in addition to bearing the probably more typical consequences of being victimized by violence and hate, they're also a primary target for extremism, and that's across the spectrum. So young people are always going to be a fundamental part of PCVE. It's just a question of how we make them a part of PCVE.
Would you say that right now young practitioners are still mostly being seen as, practitioners that can aid and help us better understand, but are not fully doing the practitioning work?
We are keeping youth too separate from the rest of the field. A lot of these youth programs exist in parallel. And we look at ways that, how can you support this? How can you support that? Rather than how can we integrate them into full partners in this process and treat them like the practitioners they are? And there's a lot of consequences from keeping them separate.
What sort of young people do you then primarily see that are working within the PCVE field?
So within Europe, at least, it's more often going to be people who are interested in PCVE as a career. So you're going to get people who are well educated, not necessarily affluent, but who have a real academic interest in the topic and have taken steps to be able to pursue that interest. When we're talking about youth involvement in PCVE beyond that, I think what people also mean are the sort of civil society or like community projects that are really begun by youth or led by youth or started by youth. And a lot of that's, it's small scale, it's response to individual things. And that's where you start seeing more variety. But right now, there's too much reliance on a very specific profile of young people. And those are people who are interested and who have sought it out and who, want to be involved. And that doesn't always, sometimes it does, but it doesn't always represent young people as a whole, or more importantly, the young people who are maybe going to be targeted through some of these PCVE efforts.
How can we engage more, a more diverse array of young people within PCVE work?
Yeah, I think this is a really, really important question. I think this is really going to get down to the heart of, what it means to have young people engaged in PCVE. I think firstly is creating more space for young people to define what getting involved means. PCVE is incredibly dynamic. You have things that are, very directly, overtly PCVE, but there's also a lot of things that contribute to preventing and countering violent extremism. And a lot of young people are doing really good work that they would not consider PCVE, but is critical to, reaching a lot of the same goals that we have. And a lot of the opportunities that we create to get young people involved in, PCVE are volunteering based. And a lot of the youth-led organizations do not have salaries, and their entire organization is run based on volunteering. But volunteering is a luxury for those who can afford it, and it excludes those who cannot. And often the ones who are excluding are the ones that we want most to be including. Because if we truly believe that what young people have to offer PCVE is important, then we need to treat it as important and we need to compensate them.
It's interesting. Hey, and all of this does tap into the fact that you've also been a part of the RAN Young platform. Maybe I'm just curious to hear from you, what does the RAN Young platform do? Who's a part of it? How does it operate?
So RAN, as a whole, it is largely a network for different kinds of practitioners. And for RAN Young, they've really taken that concept and transferred it to youth. So they're working primarily with young people who are practitioners. So specifically targeting young professionals that are in the field. think there's maybe 8 different countries represented in the current cohort. So every time they come together, they're getting to exchange experiences that they're having in their own countries and getting to kind of stay up to date on what it's like for practitioners in different parts of the EU. But it's also kind of a breaking down of this barrier between youth work and primary PCVE work, which I think is something that Ran Young is doing exceptionally well and something that I think it's going to continue doing going into the future.
With all of this in mind and everything that we've discussed, if we're looking ahead, what would you say that the future holds for the Ran Young network?
This continued integration of the youth practitioners into the rest of the network in a way that's really meaningful. That's, I hope, is going to be something that they continue really focusing on going forward, because it's unique and it's so needed.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much indeed, moving from just youth participation to meaningful youth participation in that sense. Kelsey, thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. Thank you. Well, that's it for this special report. I'd like to thank our guests for joining us remotely, and also a special thank you to Annelies for joining us here in the studio.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. Thanks.
Now, to everyone who's watching, please do go to the Ran Practitioner's website, where you can access papers and read the latest research and thinking on this and many other topics. This program has come to you from the Radicalization Awareness Network. Until next time, goodbye.